Evaluating magic cards can be a tricky thing. Even the most experienced players can't always look at a card and figure out whether or not it's going to be good. This is because Magic is an incredibly complex game, and without playing with cards, it can be difficult to figure out how powerful the effects they have actually are. One of the most notable examples of this is Necropotence. When it was first revealed in 1995, many players thought it was a terrible card. After all, it keeps you from being able to draw cards normally, and why would you ever want to pay life to draw cards, especially when you have to wait until your next end step to get those cards? However, Necropotence, of course, turned out to be one of the best card draw engines ever printed, to the point that they even had to ban it in multiple formats, and today, it's considered one of the most powerful cards ever. So, while evaluating how good a card is going to be is tough, I also think it can be pretty difficult to look at older Magic cards and figure out how good they used to be. This is because if you don't know the metagame and the power level of the cards in their original context, you aren't really going to understand the card. I've done a couple of videos now, taking a look at 10 cards that used to be really good, even though they aren't very impressive to today's Magic players, and there are tons of other cards in this category. So in this MTG Top 10, I'm going to look at 10 more cards that look terrible to today's players, but were once so good that they were quite successful in competitive Magic. While most of my top 10s use rankings, that's not the case here because this list is super subjective. These are just 10 cards that look bad today but used to be great in no particular order. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Let's start with Erratic Explosion. For 2 generic and a red, it's a sorcery that lets you choose any target, and then you reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a non-land, and Erratic Explosion does damage equal to that card's mana value to the chosen target. This card seems way too, well, erratic, to be something that would work well in competitive Magic, doesn't it? I mean, you have to stack your deck just the right way or it's going to be woefully inefficient. That's a ton of setup for a card that does nothing but damage. However, Erratic Explosion actually saw some considerable play in Extended starting in 2002, where it was partially the namesake for a deck called Draco Explosion. Draco could be on this list just as much as Erratic Explosion could, since it's a super expensive creature that demands lots of setup and doesn't pay you off in a very significant way, but when it's on the top of your library when you cast Erratic Explosion, you do 16 damage to your opponent. These decks use Scroll Rack to stack their deck and pull this off, and they had no real other way to win the game. Draco was virtually uncastable in the deck too, so this doesn't seem like a combo that is worthwhile, especially when the deck's 2 main cards are pretty awful without one another, and, to top it all off, 16 damage isn't even enough to one-shot the opponent. Well, that would normally be true, but the metagame in Extended in 2002 was filled with decks that like to damage themselves. Decks were packing a whole lot of lands that damage their controller, like the Painland Cycle, City of Brass, Fetch Lands, and Barbarian Ring, the list goes on. So 16 damage was often enough to end the game. And in an emergency, the deck could cast Cunning Wish to grab a Fault Line out of the sideboard to do the last few damage. But yeah, this deck mostly sounds like absolute jank today, but in a metagame where opponents were often lowering their life total to 16 all on their own, this was a 2-card combo that could win the game pretty quickly. This deck would actually seem even jankier if it weren't for the fact that calibrated blast decks are a thing in Modern right now, and there's kind of a similar situation, where mini decks hurt themselves a lot with shock lands and fetch lands. But it's worth noting that Erratic Explosion is way worse since it's a sorcery that doesn't have flashback, and calibrated blast decks are really just 5-color domain decks that can actually cast a whole bunch of creatures, not a deck built entirely around winning with the blast. Now let's look at another seemingly awful spell, Enduring Ideal. For 5 generic and 2 white, it's a sorcery that lets you tutor up an enchantment and put it directly on the battlefield, and it also has Epic, which means that for the rest of the game, you can't cast spells. In exchange for that massive downside, you get to copy Enduring Ideal during your upkeep every turn. I often see Epic come up when people want to talk about the worst mechanics in the history of Magic, but Enduring Ideal's significant success on the competitive scene precludes the mechanic from ever belonging on any such list. Now, it is true that the other 4 epic spells are horrendous, but Enduring Ideal was actually really good in both Standard and Extended, spawning an entire deck built around it, and I think these are among some of the sweetest decks of all time. So what made it worth it to cut yourself off from ever casting a spell again? Well, the idea was to use Enduring Ideal to construct a prison your opponent couldn't escape from. Form of the Dragon, a card which could probably be on the list in its own right, was key here, as it made it so only flyers could attack you, while also letting you do 5 to any target during your upkeep. This could quickly kill your opponent or clear away problem creatures while protecting you. Although the very fact it lowers your life total to 5 was a bit of a problem, it became a lot less of one when you could grab Ivory Mask to stop direct damage, or Confiscate to take away opposing flyers. Basically, this deck had answers for almost anything, and it was actually well worth giving up the ability to cast a spell in exchange for getting the best enchantment out of your deck every single turn. An Enduring Ideal deck even top 8'd the World Championship in 2005, in addition to achieving many other top 8s in Standard and Extended between 2005 and 2008. Enduring Ideal is actually a really cool card, and its power makes it a lot sadder that the other cards in the Epic cycle are so uninteresting and so terrible. Now that we've looked at a couple of sorceries, let's take a look at a massive creature, Krosan Cloudscraper. For 7 generic and 3 green mana, it's a 13/13, and at the beginning of your upkeep you have to pay 2 green or sacrifice it. While this creature is definitely huge, it's largely a vanilla creature, making it hard for it to take advantage of its body, and that's despite the fact that it does also have Morph, meaning you can cast it face down for 3 generic mana, in which case it's a 2/2. You can turn the Cloudscraper face up at any time for its Morph cost, but it's not like you get much of a discount when you do, since it's 7 generic and 2 green. So yeah, maybe the dream is that you can sneak this past your opponent and then pay 9 to turn it face up and slam in for 13, but you're spending a whole lot of mana to pull that off, and there's no guarantee that it ever works out. However, there was one deck that found a way to make use of this big dumb creature, but kind of like with Draco and Erratic Explosion, it wasn't because people were trying to cast it, and instead the decks that used it simply tried to take advantage of the massive numbers on the card. Back in 2005, there was an extended graveyard combo deck that used Cephalid Illusionist plus a way to target it for free, like Shuko, to mill the entire library. This worked because the Illusionist mills 3 cards anytime it gets targeted, and Shuko's equip cost of 0 allows you to do it as many times as you want. This deck's win condition was then casting Reanimate or Exhume to bring back a Sutured Ghoul. The Ghoul exiles any number of creatures from your graveyard when it enters, and its power and toughness are equal to the total power and toughness of the cards you exile. In other words, the Cloudscrapers would turn into stats for the Ghoul, which was now a huge creature with Trample, and it also had haste thanks to Dragon Breath or Anger being in the graveyard. So yeah, even back then, Krosan Cloudscraper was a bad card if you were planning on putting it into play, but once you were putting those huge stats on an even bigger creature with haste and Trample that could really easily end the game in a single swing, Krosan Cloudscraper can actually do something really useful. Let's look at another morph creature now, Brine Elemental, which was printed a few years after the Cloudscraper. For 4 generic and 2 blue mana, it's a 5/4 with morph, and its morph cost is 5 generic and 2 blue, and when it turns face up, each opponent skips their next untap step. There's a lot going on here that really doesn't make this seem like a good card. I mean, playing it face up as a 6 mana 5/4 is awful, and playing it face down for 3 generic and then spending 7 more mana later in the game to keep your opponent from untapping doesn't exactly sound great. I mean, sure, sometimes that effect can be good, but you spent 10 total mana to get to the point where the elemental could do its thing, so it's kind of like you skipped your untap step too. That definitely doesn't seem like it could ever be worth it. Certainly not in 60 card formats. But there was one particular deck in Block and Standard that could do some incredibly nasty things with Brine Elemental, a deck that even used the humorous name Pickles in reference to the fact that some pickles are made using brine. So how could this creature ever be the centerpiece of any deck? Well, the trick here was creating a lock where your opponent would never untap. This could be achieved by combining the elemental with Vesuvan Shapeshifter. This is a creature that has Morph itself, and when it turns face up, it can become a copy of any creature on the battlefield. Importantly, this means that when it copies another Morph creature, it gets that creature's "when this creature is turned face up" trigger, and in this case, the Shapeshifter's Morph cost is only 1 generic and a blue, so you get the Elemental's powerful effect for a massive discount. But things don't end there. You also can choose to turn the Shapeshifter face down during your upkeep every single turn. So as long as you have a Brine Elemental around, you can make it so your opponent never untaps again. And while a combo using a couple of fragile creatures might normally be a little too fragile, it doesn't really matter when you've choked off all of your opponent's resources. Eventually you overtake them with your creatures when they're completely defenseless. Pickles decks found significant success in both Block and Standard between 2006 and 2007, and this seemingly inefficient creature was crucial to those decks' success. Let's look now at Force of Nature, which, like Krosan Cloudscraper, is a massive green creature that appears to have too big of a downside by today's standards. For 2 generic and 4 green, it's an 8/8 with trample. That's not too bad, even by today's standards, but it's not amazing either. But the rest of the Force's text box is all downside, because you have to pay a whopping 4 green mana during your upkeep. Otherwise, it turns around and punches you in the face for 8 damage. Notably, it doesn't get sacrificed or tapped when you fail to pay the cost, as with some cards, and that comes with both upsides and downsides. Keeping your creatures nice, but potentially getting punched in the face again on your next turn definitely isn't. However, Force of Nature was a heck of a lot better in the early days of competitive Magic. In fact, it was so good that it achieved a top 8 at the game's second ever World Championship. This is partly because of the simple fact that creatures at the time were much, much worse than they are today, so getting a 6 mana 8/8 Trampler, even with a downside that will make it hard for you to ever cast other spells, was a great deal. And it's important to put the Force in its original context to realize just how huge it was for the time. It was quite literally the biggest creature in the game for the first full year of Magic, and while bigger creatures or creatures of the same size were eventually printed in 1994 and 1995, they were creatures like Colossus of Sardia, Leviathan, Polar Kraken, and Marjan. Yeah, those cards are absolute garbage and always have been, as they come with massive downsides that make what Force of Nature requires you to do look like no big deal, especially because it costs way less mana than every single one of them. So yeah, if you wanted a big threatening creature for the first few years of Magic, you couldn't really do any better than Force of Nature, a creature that could absolutely wreck all the other creatures that were on the board when it came down, and it could also come down ahead of schedule, thanks to mana dorks like Llanowar Elves and Birds of Paradise, and once it hit the board, your opponent had to kill it or die in very few turns, even if you were paying extra mana to keep it around. Let's continue with a look at creatures with huge downsides. This time, let's look at Troublesome Spirit. For 2 generic and 2 blue mana, it's a 3/4 with flying, and at the end of your turn, you tap all lands you control. While this is yet another case of a card performing better than you'd think simply because it was more efficient in its original context, even once you correct for that, the Spirit looks like something of a head-scratcher. Blue is not exactly a color that's interested in tapping out. Even blue tempo decks like to have up interaction to protect their creatures. But Troublesome Spirit makes that impossible. If anything, Troublesome Spirit almost seems like some anti-blue tech where you donate this to your opponent because you're sick of them having mana to interact on your turn. However, Troublesome Spirit was actually one of the best creatures in mono-blue tempo decks in Standard in 2000 and 2001. How could that ever be possible when it's a card that taps all of your lands? Well, mostly because that Standard format was really messed up. It featured multiple spells that you could cast without needing any mana at all, and blue decks were already leaning on this type of card. So in many ways, the Spirit doesn't actually have a meaningful downside. After all, decks were using Daze, Foil, Thwart, and Misdirection. That's right, that's 3 free counterspells. And Misdirection, which is pretty close to a counterspell. So yeah, today Troublesome Spirit would have a hard time finding traction in blue decks, between the fact its stat line is no longer impressive, and the fact that blue decks can't really afford to tap all of their lands every single turn, and that's thankfully because Wizards of the Coast learned their lesson when it comes to printing free counterspells. Speaking of Troublesome Spirits, I hope it's not too troublesome for me to ask you to subscribe. I'm closing in on 100,000 subscribers and would love to meet that milestone by the end of the year. Only about half of my viewers are actually subscribed, so I would really appreciate your help in reaching this huge channel milestone. Now let's move from one spirit to another, this time Spirit of the Night. For 6 generic and 3 black mana, it's a 6/5 with flying, trample, haste, protection from black, and it has first strike as long as it's attacking. So the good news is that Spirit of the Night has no real downside, unless you look at its absolutely massive mana cost, of course. This thing isn't even worth close to 9 mana, and that was actually true back in 1998 too. However, kind of like with Force of Nature, Spirit of the Night was the scariest creature in the game in its original context. This was so much the case that the Spirit's very existence helped spawn Magic's very first competitive Reanimator decks. After all, if you can get this into play ahead of schedule, it represents a really scary clock thanks to haste, and there was literally nothing capable of blocking it and taking it down in the game at the time. Basically, Spirit of the Night was the Atraxa of 1998. Back then, having a creature that was hard to interact with and represented a huge clock was plenty to win the game with. As a result, recurring survival decks dominated the 1998 World Championship, and Spirit of the Night was a big part of that. These decks combined 2 insane enchantments from Exodus. Survival of the Fittest, and Recurring Nightmare. Survival allowed these decks to turn any creature in their hand into a tutor, and Recurring Nightmare gave you a repeatable way to reanimate stuff. Survival could both enable your reanimation by letting you discard stuff, and find your reanimation targets by tutoring them up. This deck was more than capable of reanimating Spirit of the Night on turn 3, and the game was virtually over when that happened. In addition to the game's other creatures being so bad against it, there also wasn't much removal in Standard that could take it down. If you look at the top 8 decks at the 1998 World Championship, you won't find a single card in the 75 of any deck that could actually do the job. The most played removal at the event was Fire Blast and Necrotal, and as great as those cards are, they do stone nothing against the Spirit. Today, Spirit of the Night isn't even that good when you cheat it into play, so it can be hard to imagine that it was ever a premium reanimation target, but it certainly was in 1998, and Recurring Nightmare and Survival of the Fittest made it very easy to kill your opponent with a Spirit of the Night in a hurry. Next, let's look at Soldevi Digger. For 2 generic mana, it's an artifact with an activated ability that costs 2 generic, and it lets you put the top card of your graveyard on the bottom of your library. Yeah, that's a very small effect, and one that doesn't even impact the board. I mean, sure, it can be fun in some commander decks like River Song or Grenzo, who let you do stuff with the bottom card of your library, but it's probably pretty hard to believe that this card was once good in 60-card competitive formats, but it was. Control and Prison decks in 1996 and 1997 could turn this into a legitimate win condition. For example, it appeared in the top 8 of the 1996 World Championship, where it was featured in a Stasis deck. This Prison enchantment makes players skip their untap steps, and these decks didn't run any way to lower the opponent's life at all, so they leaned entirely on the opponent eventually running out of cards. While Stasis is symmetrical, these decks had plenty of ways to get around that, most notably by bouncing Stasis and getting to have a turn with an untap step whenever they wanted to, and just activating the Digger a few times was often enough to keep you from milling out before your opponent did. So, yeah, it seems super silly, and today there are lots of better ways to keep yourself from milling out, but in Standard in 1996 and 1997, Soldevi Digger was an actual win condition, which tells you a lot about how powerful Control and Prison decks in that format could be. They could grind the game to a screeching halt and just win the game with Soldevi Digger, and that's pretty absurd. Let's look at another artifact now, Aeolipile. And yes, that is how you pronounce it. It's actually a real word for a steam engine-like invention from the 2nd century BCE, although it isn't a weapon or explosive as seems to be depicted in this magic card. Anyway, it's 2 generic mana for an artifact, and you can pay 1 generic, tap it, and sacrifice it to do 2 damage to any target. Have you ever wanted to spend 3 times the mana on shock? Well, this thing has you covered. While the effect it has can be useful, it's a woefully inefficient way to do 2 damage, and yet it achieves several top 8s in the Standard of 1996 and 1997. Part of the reason for this is a weird deck building rule for Standard, which required you to include at least 5 cards from each set that was legal in the format at the time, and Fallen Empires, where Aeolipile is from, was not exactly a set filled with powerful cards for every type of deck. And that's definitely what led to some of its success, especially at the Pro Tour level, but it continued to see play even after that rule was no longer in place, especially in white and black decks, and there's a big reason for that. White and black both had to put up with creatures that had protection from their removal. There were 2 separate mirrored pairs that saw a ton of play at the time, Order of Lightbur and Order of Ebon Hand, as well as Order of the White Shield and Knight of Stromgald. Yeah, all of these were in Standard at the same time, which is pretty ridiculous. So if you were a monocolored black or white deck, and there were lots of those at the time, you were going to have a serious problem with those creatures, but not if you packed some Aeolipiles into your deck, as it gave you a way to deal with those annoying creatures. Notably, Aeolipile saw play in the main deck, because it was also passable against the rest of the field, while also giving you a great silver bullet against the right opponent. Let's wrap things up with one last artifact, Serrated Arrows. For 4 generic mana, it's an artifact that enters with 3 arrowhead counters on it, and at the beginning of your upkeep, if there are no arrowhead counters on it, you sacrifice it. You can tap it to remove an arrowhead counter and put a -1/-1 counter on target creature. Getting 3 -1/-1 counters for 4 mana already isn't that impressive, and 4 mana for a card that gives you those counters really slowly is even worse. So how in the world is this the most successful card in this video, and by a wide margin? Well, I wanted to talk about Serrated Arrows in particular because I think there are some misconceptions about it. I've regularly heard a narrative about this card that really doesn't stand up to scrutiny. This narrative states that Serrated Arrows only ever saw play in competitive Magic as a result of the deck building rules in Standard during the first half of 1996, but this simply isn't true, as you can see from its very impressive resume. I mean, sure, it would probably have fewer top 8s if it weren't for those deck building rules, but the vast majority of its success came in formats where it wasn't required that you play any cards from homelands, and people were playing it anyway. So, what's the deal? How is it possible that this clunky artifact was one of the most successful Magic cards of the mid to late 1990s? Well, it's for the same reasons that Aeolipile saw play, namely that it gave decks a way to kill really obnoxious creatures that were normally really good tech against them, like those various knights that have protection, which Serrated Arrows could kill in a single activation. Those weren't the only X1s prevalent in Magic's formats at the time either. In an era where creatures were often less efficient, there were plenty of creatures who would die to a single -1/-1 counter, like Jackal Pups, Savannah Lions, various Mana Elves and Birds of Paradise, Elvish Archers, the list goes on. The point is, against many opponents, Serrated Arrows was capable of killing a creature every single turn, and if you imagine Serrated Arrows doing that for 3 turns, it suddenly seems like it's worth 4 mana, right? Serrated Arrows saw heavy play in Standard in both 1996 and 1997, then transitioned to Extended where it had new targets like Soltari Priest and Sukata Firewalker. Later, it was printed on the Time Spiral bonus sheet, and even as late as 2008, Serrated Arrows was a good card in both Block and Standard, as there was still plenty of value to be had with this 4 mana artifact. So no, Serrated Arrows didn't only see play because of a weird deck building rule, it was actually a very powerful card. One of the most significant cards in Magic for a time, because it gave decks of any color access to removal, even against creatures that would normally be a problem. Those arrowhead counters have killed countless creatures over this card's long history. So those are 10 cards that don't look very good to today's players, but were once really good. If you want to own any of these cards to relive their glory days, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on more MTG Top 10s, including 2 more that look at this specific topic, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.